Today is one of my favorites. We'll be talking about Abraham Lincoln. Um, and this is, I love teaching about this period of history, particularly Lincoln. It's not just the man himself, but it's also nothing puts the United States in context better than a story like this. The story of Abraham Lincoln, as we know it, in context of the Civil War, of course, considers an understanding of the American Revolution, the United States Constitution, particularly the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, the Mexican-American War, the new territories that were brought into the United States as a result of the Mexican-American War, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Whigs, Republicans, Democrats, immigration demographics from the North versus the South in the period of time before the Civil War, and the agricultural nature of the South, and the history of the United States vis-a-vis Europe, that the Southern states wanted to kind of bring into the future with Southern aristocracy being the heir to that the aristocratic lives of the Europe, you see, with a lower class and an elite class that ran everything. Um, this one here could have been the entire five-part series that we're going to do here today, but we have an hour and a half. All right, so I'm going to go to my screen share and pull up my Abraham Lincoln presentation. There we go. So one of the great things about this is that we have photography at this point. And photography is something not just Matthew Brady, et cetera, but others. And it gives us finally a photographic record of some of the people, at least, that we're talking about and the Civil War in all of its carnage. Um, some of what we're talking about as far as Lincoln's youth is before photography, of course, but not much. There's a great picture of Abraham Lincoln. You know, he's wearing a beard because somebody actually, one of his supporters, a young girl, wrote him a letter and thought that he would look better with a beard. And he decided to grow a beard. And that's how he wound up with a beard, of course, which gives him that signature look, of course. So, he had to sit there for a photograph like that for a long time. And this is one of these things where the photographer has that black thing that goes over your head and you're looking through the camera and he has to pose. Notice that he's leaning on a book or his elbows leaning on a book. Right, just a couple of quick facts here. He is born in 1809 in February, Hodgenville, Kentucky. Now, this is, remember, back in these days, this is the frontier. This is the Wild West, right? Kentucky's the Wild West. That's about as far out as you can get back in those days and still be part of settler colonial America. Well, not colonial America, but rather settler America. Um, and just total poverty. His father, Lincoln's father, he had a sister, an older sister, Lincoln. But his father, who was a widower, early on in Lincoln's life, he wasn't good at making money. He did some carpentry, he did some other things. And he left the children there alone for quite some time while he went he left for months to go and bring back a bride. So he would have a proper woman as his wife. and a stepmother to the children, including Lincoln. Now, as it turns out, Lincoln had a very good relationship with his stepmother, and which is obviously is always not always the case, but the stepmother believed in Lincoln, and the father didn't have an understanding of Lincoln's capabilities. Lincoln did not want to be what most people were at that time, which was a farmer, especially back in those frontier places. And Lincoln had an aptitude for hard work and other sorts of things, but it wasn't, he didn't love it and he didn't want to do it and he didn't want to live his life doing it. You see, it was something that his father never understood. I can't blame his father for that. I mean, people have a limited exposure to certain things, even to this day, let alone back in those days, in understanding your children. So in 1816, you can see that the entire family moves to Indiana. In 1830, family moves to Illinois, where Lincoln becomes a clerk. Right now, this is where his life really takes off. When he goes to Illinois, this is something his father thought that he had gone off to waste his life on some crazy dream, whatever that dream was. Lincoln, this was the first time actually that he had the chance to really be part of as a cosmopolitan area where you had influences from around the world, etc. He did many, many things. He was a postman. He ran a store. He did various things, and he had an appetite for information and knowledge and world events. And he always had a love for politics. Politics. So I guess some people have an aptitude for that or an interest in that, and some people just don't. And but he sure did. And he was a self-taught man. He had maybe a 1 year of formal education. That was about it for Lincoln. And he studied on his own, and he found certain mentors that allowed him to gain a hold of what he was reading. And he had a natural aptitude for the information that he was absorbing. And he passes the bar exam. That's quite a feat. And 1834 to 1842, he's invited to be a member of the Illinois legislature, right? As I said, in 1836, he's admitted to the bar. 1847 to 1849, he becomes a United States representative from Illinois. So now he's in Congress, right? 1858, while he's running for the Senate, Lincoln's running for the Senate, he debates his longtime rival, right, Stephen Douglas. Very sharp character, and it is this. We could do a five-part series just on the Lincoln Douglas debates. This is something that is remarkable because when people who are interested in political discourse lament about, I don't know, the lack of quality of some of the discourse that we have today in our present political discourse, and you could look back to something like the Lincoln Douglas debates and see real Socratic dialogue. One person gets up and they have their say. The other person gets up, they have their say. It's witty, it's informative. There's no teleprompters, nobody's got any notes. It's not edited by some major news network and fed to the public in bits and pieces to serve a purpose. The Lincoln Douglas debates is the high watermark for intellectual discourse. And it represented a polar difference, a clear polar difference between not only two candidates, but what the candidates represented at this time. And what the candidates represented at this time was Lincoln has emerged as something new, right? Because Lincoln is the first candidate, right, running for major office now, that is saying that the United States, in its expansion west, into the new territories should exclude slavery going forward. You see, now that was to become the Republican Party, and that was the Republican Party platform. I want to make a distinction here. It's very important to understand. Lincoln nor the Republican Party were abolitionists, right? So there's a contradiction or misunderstanding I think that people have. Lincoln said many times that if he could end the Civil War without freeing a single slave, he would do it. You see, so the thing is that Lincoln was, and the Republican Party, where the Whigs were to shift over to the Republican Party, they were not for the abolition of slavery as it existed, where it existed, right? As a policy. The policy difference was that it was going to be ceasing slave states in the new territories that were seeking statehood in the United States. That was the difference. Now, what that represented was a tremendous threat to the southeastern portion of our country, which, of course, as you know, were slave-holding states. And think about the kind of congressional competitions that we have now, right? Like, in other words, we've got to make sure that our opposition doesn't get that passed, because if that gets passed, that's going to put our power in jeopardy, right? Now, even though it's not said that way, that's pretty much what we're talking about. In Lincoln's day, back here, what was happening was the southern states, if they were not allowed, which remember, they were all represented in Congress. If Congress passed a law where new states or new territories applying as states, better put, could not become slaveholding states, then as the United States expanded into who knows how many states by the time you get to California and Oregon, then that means that the power of the southern slaveholding states will become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, you see? So, as you know, the majority in Congress, in the Senate and in Congress, if you've got a majority, you have a greater chance of getting whatever you want passed. And it's already very clear that the Northern Whigs then turned into the Republicans. The northern part of the country was already anti-slavery in essence, right? If not yet in fact. And so the southern states knew that if new territories could not be slave states, that they would eventually become a minority in Congress, and then inevitably the United States as a policy, as the law, would make slavery legal. And the southern states would have no say in it because they would just be outnumbered. See, so it was really what today this is an overused term we have today. It became an existential crisis for the South. And here, even in the Senate during these debates, Lincoln, this is where Lincoln made his name. He became a household name at this point, because he was such a good orator. And, he started off a little shaky, but he knew what he was talking about, and he believed in his convictions. And therefore, there was a tone of competency and sincerity about what he was saying. Now, Douglas was just as competent and just as sincere, you see. But basically, the argument was, and Lincoln was the first one to represent this, right? This is what I want to focus on. Lincoln was the first person in public life in the United States of a high stature or to become a high stature that made clear what um, what was trying to be said in the Declaration of Independence, which is that all men are created equal, right? Now, during the actual Revolutionary War, when the Declaration of Independence was issued and then announced to the world as this declaration, those words, all men are created equal, I mean, that was basically the first time something like that was articulated in that fashion. And Thomas Jefferson, the writer of those words, knew that there was some hypocrisy involved because the United States, well, I mean, a large portion of people held slaves, including the founding fathers. And so, what about it? So, Jefferson wanted to take care of that then. And that, of course, didn't happen because the clause that Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence saying, well, I don't know the exact wording, but if all men are created equal, therefore, then slavery is incompatible with that, and we intend to get rid of it. Of course, you don't see that in the Declaration of Independence because it's not there because it was edited out. It was edited out after it was written by Jefferson, because at that particular time, the Declaration would have had no teeth whatsoever in its stated intent in declaring independence against Great Britain if all 13 colonies weren't unanimously united in the Declaration of Independence. And there was no way that the Southern states were going to sign something said we're going to get rid of slavery. You see, so it was like basically compromise, the first compromise, which was like, all right, let's break away from Great Britain. And we know we have this flaw here, this fundamental philosophical flaw, and we're just going to have to deal with it. And the thing is that Lincoln was the first person in that rung who actually was saying, okay, so since all men are created equal, then obviously slavery is incompatible with that entire philosophical notion. And basically, aren't we all hypocrites? You see, and that is the importance of Lincoln in American history, at least from the angle that I'm coming from. And there were enough people around. You know, demographics of our country had changed enormously by the middle of the 19th century. And you had northern states which had tremendous immigration from Europe and other places. It was a little before my ancestors came in, which was right around 1900, that sort of a thing, but no difference really. And then you had a lot of Irish people, you had all kinds of other laborers, and they were in the North because the North now had become an industrial mecca of places. Chicago, the area around the Great Lakes, New York, for instance, and places like that. And proximity to coal, proximity to transportation, railroads, that sort of a thing. I mean, we did programs on Connecticut industry, et cetera. You have a skilled labor force, you have multiple waterways, north and south, that create not electricity rather, but power even before steam power was available via water wheels, et cetera. And then transportation via Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean, right? All very, very critical. You see, so what happened here was the North became industrialized, you see, and that changed the demographic of everything, absolutely everything. But the South became much more contrasted to the North during this period of time. Remember, we had steam locomotion since 1820-ish, and everything was shifting towards that mechanized mentality and the reality of life. Farm equipment, factories, everything. No longer did you need to have, running water to turn a wheel with a steam engine, basically. You could practically run a factory 24 hours a day if you had a way of illuminating something. And the South wasn't like that. The South was filled with people who were, not everybody, most of the people in the South were small agriculture, mom and pop farms, things like that, family farms, right? But the South was the home, of course, of large plantations. And remember, I was talking about the Industrial Revolution. Well, the Industrial Revolution actually made slavery even more profitable because now you had machines that could pick, but like Eli Whitney's, what do they call that thing? The steam gin or something, right? You know what I'm talking about. And the South wanted to create a lot of agricultural products. And they had no problem with the fact that you had all of these slaves there doing it. It was a way of life. It was a almost a cultural entitlement. That's what I was talking about before when I said it has to do with old Europe, right? So even George Washington, et cetera, it was the idea with us here on this continent was that we weren't there anymore in Europe with its class distinctions and it's almost like a caste system, where if you're in the aristocracy, then you could be a complete moron because you're from the right family or the right pedigree. You're still going to have the girl you want. You're still going to have the life you want. You're still going to have the titles that you want, even if you're a complete moron, right? And at least the promise over in the new world, whereas like it would be, I guess you would call it a merit-based sort of a thing. Now, obviously, that wasn't true for everybody. It was mostly true for white Protestant men. If you were a Catholic, if you were a Jew, if you didn't look the right way, if you didn't own land, that sort of a thing. There were a lot of things that had to be culled out. But the United States was the first time an average person from a lower class could actually work their way up, or at least have the promise of doing that. Um, so the South didn't want that kind of change. They didn't want to see what you saw in the North, which were common people, laborers, actually earning wages and actually having a chance of what today I guess we would call the middle class. The South saw themselves as the heirs to the best of that aristocracy, that exclusionary aristocracy that existed in Europe, right? There's no problem with us being in like another, I guess elites would be a word you would use. And then you have this entire underclass that was there to provide the means to your superiority. You see, so we already had a massive cultural clash in the early part of the 19th century. Lincoln Douglas debates showed the two sides of the argument that I just gave you. Now, by this time, also, more people are literate in this country. And with that literacy came the ability to read newspapers, etc. You see? So the American argument here was, I mean, the country was truly polarized. I mean, it is, of course, accurate. I mean, it's not like, somebody's pulling his plow behind a mule someplace and he says, wait a minute. And he just gets an update on his iPhone and it tells you, the latest thing that happened in the Lincoln Douglas debates. I mean, there's still weeks of time that go by until you get a new newspaper or something like that. You say, but nevertheless, the country is engaged in the way that no other country is engaged before. And the populace is involved. Now, as you can see, Lincoln becomes the president in 1861, and that's only because he was catapulted into notoriety by the Lincoln Douglas debates, becoming, of course, the first Republican president. Now, Lincoln wasn't even sworn in yet, and South Carolina was already making plans on seceding from the Union, right? And the thing is that everybody can see if you're in the South, that the Republican Party, in its platform of not allowing, or at least being against, the expansion of slave states into new territories was a threat to the existence of every slaveholding state in the South. So I want you to think about this. Think about it in current terms. If Lincoln gets in, we are going to have to create a massive resistance. Okay? We're not going to wait to become turned into obsolete fossils where our entire life is lifestyle and all of our beliefs and what we hold dear and sacred and our traditions and our heritage. We're not going to have that taken away from us. We are going to proactively resist the federal government because the federal government is now being run by a man who's going to install people to do his policies, obviously, that is actually going to do things that are unconstitutional to us. And we have to do something proactively before we let them do it to us. You see? And so the South saw itself completely in the correct, in the right. Now we look at it today through our lens of presentism. And we say, well, I mean, we have to eradicate every statue that there is that had to do with the Confederacy, et cetera, like that, because obviously they represented and were fighting for the side of slavery. And that is true, right? But then the South saw itself in the right against what was going to now be an out of control federal government now that Lincoln was in. Now, what was Lincoln going to do that was going to be out of control, that was going to be unlawful, right? And what the South said was going to be unlawful and why they had to take action against the federal government before the federal government took action against them, the Southern states, was contained in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, right? The last part of the Bill of Rights. The 10th Amendment is the one that stipulates that, let me just give you a little context. Nobody even wanted to sign on or ratify the Constitution when it was developed because it was going to create a president of the United States and it was going to create what was going to be obviously a large or what larger than most comfortable federal government. And the scare of that was that, well, shoot, I mean, didn't we just fight the Revolutionary War to get rid of a government that we couldn't control? We want to be in control of the government, we the people, you see. We just got rid of King George and Parliament and the Army and the Royal Army and the Royal Navy. And what are we going to do? We're going to turn around and create the same thing ourselves on our own soil? No. So the Constitution, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, says that the federal government is only responsible for these things. Everything else that isn't specifically listed in the Constitution is the purview of the states, right? So from this standpoint, and this is argued right to this very day, as you know, if you're interested in these sorts of things, is that, well, if it ain't in the Constitution, why is the federal government in charge of it? You see? Then shouldn't it be that the states are going to have their authority to do as they see, under the notion that it was the states that got together and created the federal government to serve the needs of the United States, right? So today we literally have an inverted viewpoint of that, which is that, well, the states are kind of like subcategories of the federal government, you see. And that brings out one of the tensions that exists today, right? Now, if I was to say to you, well, the state should be in charge of all of these different things, then somebody would point out to me, oh, well, do you think that in 1962 or whatever it was, I forgot the exact year, that, no, it wouldn't have been 1962, it would have been the late 1950s when Eisenhower sent in the army to allow black children to go into schools because it was their 14th Amendment was being violated, right? Because they couldn't get an education. So are you saying that the federal government shouldn't have the authority to override states that think that they're doing the right thing because the state is the sovereign power? And I would say, well, of course, the federal government has the supremacy clause in those regards to act against states that are being unconstitutional. Right. Now, as far as the South is concerned, the South looked at the 10th Amendment and said, if we are a legitimate state or any territory that wants to join the Union is by de facto a sovereign state if you're achieved statehood, then you get to do what you want if it's not in the Constitution. And that means that if we choose slavery to be the law of the land in our new territory, our new state, then who is the federal government to say? You see? And you had all of these compromises back then. This brings us to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where Kansas and Nebraska, upon statehood, was the idea was like, okay, let's do something democratic. All right, here's what we're going to do. You guys decide whether or not the people of Kansas, particularly, want slavery or not, right? How can it be more democratic than that? So this is almost like this could happen today, and it wouldn't seem unusual, right? With the kind of power that we have in politics and how passionate people are. Whereas what happened was all of these people from neighboring states rushed in to Kansas to try and then they would go into Kansas and they I don't know, they drop their suitcase on the ground and say, I'm a landowner in Kansas now. And therefore I'm a citizen of Kansas, and therefore I get to vote. You see, so all of these states that were in favor of that wanted Kansas to be a slave state, all of these people came in and essentially fraudulently said that they were legitimate Kansas denizens and then voted for slavery. And then you had all of these abolitionists who equally came in fraudulently to swing the vote the other way, right? And it became there was this whole other entity, this American event called Bloody Kansas. And the kind of killing and the kind of suppression of votes and the kind of tilting the scale of those votes was something that would have seen in our worst instincts, even to this day. Okay. And it was just incredible. The inaugural address that Lincoln had, right, and other topics that he talked about even before that, he basically was saying this, we cannot live like this. And it was becoming clear that the issue of slavery was going to have to be decided. We obviously can't deal with tolerating the two sides together. It has become too political. It has become too forceful. Both sides have become too passionate. A house divided against itself cannot stand. It will have to be decided, right? So when Lincoln becomes the president, it is literally a shot across the bow to all of the southern states that the United States at large, the majority, has decided in favor of, if not the limiting of slavery, but the eradication of slavery. You see, which was something that was an existential threat to the South. So as soon as Lincoln became elected, the South went into emergency mode. And they were like, we have to settle this for ourselves now. We have to either break away from the Union and then have our own system of government, the Confederate States of America, or we have to force the United States of America, in other words, Washington, D.C., to allow us legally to maintain slavery no matter what the rest of the country does. You see? And that's obviously the beginning of the Civil War, as it turns out. Um, the southern states had federal territories in them when they seceded from the Union, right? Federal armories, forts, and the federal government under Lincoln, right? They had a situation now. And we are not going to give up the forts to whatever state is now surrounding that little island that is now part of the United States of America. The Confederate States of America have said, well, you've got this island of the United States of America in our territory. We're going to force the United States federal government to give it up because now it belongs to us because it's in our territory. And the federal government says, no, we're not going to do it because if we do that, that's going to show weakness. So eventually that happened at Fort Sumner, was where the powder keg was lit. And Fort Sumner, Lincoln tried to reinforce Fort Sumner because there was a siege around Fort Sumner in South Carolina. And the federal government was not going to have the fort surrender. And that's where the war started. The southern state, South Carolina, fired upon Fort Sumner, forcing it to surrender. And that began the Civil War. And so Lincoln is a war president. He did not want to abolish slavery. He saw it as his duty to preserve the Union, you see. And let me put this in context for a second. For somebody of Lincoln's age, the revolution wasn't that far off, right? The American Revolution for Abraham Lincoln was like, I don't know, it was like my father telling me about World War II, you know? So it is like one step removed. It's close enough where you have a personal connection to it. You see, that's the thing to remember here, right? The American Revolution, the founding of the United States of America, the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. If only the Declaration could be we can extricate ourselves from the bugs of it, right? That was something that was important to Abraham Lincoln. Keeping the United States of America together was a sacred duty. Now, anybody, when he called for arms, when he called for soldiers, Abraham Lincoln, once the war started, right? I mean, you might have had a few people who were there to say, well, I think that slavery is immoral, right? Which they probably did. Um, but maybe they didn't. All right. If you're somebody who's going to volunteer for the army to go fight the Confederates in, I don't know, 1861, 1862, there's one reason that you're there, and it's to preserve the Union. That's it. Right. The whole notion that we have looking back on this today, especially in the selective way we look at it today, is that, well, this was a 100% a moral issue. And I'm not saying that it isn't a moral issue, but we have the blindness of presentism that says our point of view from today overrides what happened for the people at the time. It's our responsibility as I don't know, students of history, to use a phrase, to actually understand ourselves, right? It's kind of like I'm not, I don't want the world to be polluted, you know? I don't. You know, I do whatever I can to recycle and all the rest of that stuff, but I'm still driving a fossil fuel car. See what I mean? So somebody 150 years ago might look at me and I might be erased historically, right? Not that I'm important enough to erase to begin with, but you see my point. The thing is that somebody in the future will look back at me and say, well, I was driving a fossil fuel car. And therefore, any notion that I actually believed in a clean environment is obviously I'm just nothing but a hypocrite. So therefore I'm not worth even considering. right? It's the same sort of thing now, in the same way that the person who wrote the Declaration of Independence had slaves, and George Washington had slaves, so that's the canceling of that now. Um, anyway, so that's the beginning of Lincoln's presidency. He's now a war president, and he wants to actually save the Union. That's what he wants to do. The whole issue of the Emancipation Proclamation comes after that. It comes after that, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. Let's go back to Lincoln. So here's where he's born. I picked this up off the internet, by the way. This is just a brochure. And the brochure is of the Knob Creek place, right? And here's a quote from Lincoln at the bottom. My earliest recollection is of the Knob Creek place. I mean, it was literally a dirt floored shack, a true log cabin. And I'd say, I mean, you don't get more humble beginnings than this. I mean, we talked about Jackson last time. But here is, and then once again, here's another point about Lincoln that is, I think, important as far as our presidents are concerned. Remember, I talked about Jackson last time, and Jackson didn't fit the mold of the Virginians, the Virginia gentlemen that came before him. And Lincoln gives us something else. He gives us the farmer president, the self-made farmer president. So if I was going to do a program, and I will be actually, on Harry Truman, it's kind of like a parallel there, right? Because if you compare Harry Truman to, I don't know, even FDR came before him. FDR, I mean, is was had a silver spoon in his mouth, was part of the famous Roosevelt family, had the right pedigree. And Harry Truman literally farmed from Missouri, when he was just a regular guy. He had a failed business. He was not a celebrity general or something like that. Harry Truman seemed like a commoner, you see, and he wasn't from the East Coast. He wasn't. He didn't go to Princeton or Harvard or something like that, you see? And it's always been a tension that we've had in our country, even to this day, about what is your pedigree and do you really belong here? And we, the anointed ones, are going to say whether or not you really have the background to do what you need to do. You see, and there's this American experience, there's this tradition, and it's embodied in Lincoln also. It's kind of like, well, yeah, I was cutting trees in half. And you know what? I'm as smart as you. That sort of a thing. And it's a bit of an American attitude of don't tell me I'm not good enough. And that's something, remember, I'm a psychology person, I'm a sociology person, I'm a counselor. I tend to think of things like this um, because it's important. All right, so here's something that I picked up. It's just a quick, cheap thing. Born in Kentucky in a log cabin, February 12th, 1809, did all kinds of hard work. Abraham Lincoln did, cleared land, split rails for fences, planted, hoed, harvested. He read books during the evening by the light of coals in the fireplace. He was a boater on the Mississippi River, which was like the major thoroughfare north and south from that part of the country. Gained quite a reputation as a wrestler. Did you know that Lincoln was a wrestler? And began practicing law in 1836, elected to the Illinois legislature and the United States Congress as president. Lincoln led the nation through the Civil War. His Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution brought an end to slavery in the United States. Well, the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal. I'll talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in a couple of minutes. And at Gettysburg, Lincoln made one of the finest speeches of all time. That is correct. Shot by an assassin on April 14th, 1865. Remembered as the man with malice towards none and charity for all. And, here's a painting, right? And there's, Lincoln with an axe in one hand and reading a book in the other. And it's true, he was an insatiable reader. Um, And he was obviously pretty damn smart, right? Slavery, we talked about that already. Lincoln Douglas isn't a great stamp. I love stamps like this. So this is 100 years after the Lincoln Douglas debates. In 1958, the stamp was issued. 4 cents. So he's running for president. This is something that somebody still had. It's the one of the, I don't know, some kind of an advertisement or flyer or something from Lincoln's candidacy, sans beard, as you can see. Hannibal Hamlin as for vice president. How's that for a name? So I'm not going to focus a lot on Mary Todd Lincoln here. In retrospect, most psychology people today look at Mary Todd and they look at Lincoln and after the fact consider Mary Todd to probably have had now what we would refer to as manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder. Okay. And Lincoln himself, we would consider to have a case of clinical depression. And, you know, that's so little Monday morning quarterbacking for that. We could talk about what manic depression is like in another seminar or another time if you want to. I wouldn't say it was a tumultuous relationship, but a lot of people would. Depends on what history you're looking at. This is nice, right? This is an artifact. So it is a nice watch, right? To Miss Mary Todd, a token of my everlasting devotion and affection, Abe Lincoln. Nice watch, isn't it? She was from a good family, a political family, and she had political chops herself. This is the house that they lived in. It's a tourist attraction now in Illinois, right? This is a surviving copy of the actual inauguration. Do you know that? Here's a fun fact. Well, I guess it wasn't fun for Lincoln. He had to sneak into Washington, D.C. after he was actually elected president. He had to sneak into Washington, D.C., had to take this kind of circuitous route to get to Washington, and he had to disguise himself because there were actually assassination plots against him because people from the South saw him as such an existential threat to constitutionality. Then therefore the our most prized possession, right, our democracy as it would be referred to back in those days, Lincoln was is seen for the Southerners as a direct threat to democracy. You see, because Lincoln represented what was going to take away their 10th Amendment right, which is obviously unconstitutional. You see, and if you could do that, well, then you could shred the Constitution and you will have a lawless society, obviously. You see, so there were a lot of assassination plots against Lincoln, and he had to actually sneak his way into Washington in disguise. March 4th, 1861, the inaugural ball. This is supposed to be the Gettysburg Address. If you've never read the Gettysburg Address or you've never heard it, and I doubt that that's true, either one of them, then that you haven't, I'd recommend it. I like to read it sometimes. I'll do this as a program and I'll give the kind of a history like I've been giving you, and then I'll actually read the Gettysburg Address. What I like about it is in a world then and now of people who talk for hours that it's kind of like you don't even know what they're talking about anymore if they do. In 2.5 minutes, this guy gets to the point of what the core issue is at Gettysburg and the meaning of the event, which is the dedication of the cemetery, that is so on target and so insightful. 2.5 minutes. So if you like brevity, that's it. Um, had several children. Back in those days, they died. There's a whole thing we could talk about the different children from Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd. Okay. His wife and two sons, Mary Todd, at this time, two sons. It's an actual photograph from 1865, right? I'm not going to read this right now. I was spending time on other stuff. I want to keep going. Good picture, right? Thanksgiving proclamation. What happens here with Lincoln? Lincoln has to thread a needle here. He wants to talk about he wants to talk about why we should be thankful. And this is in 1863. And but the thing is that by 1863, there is already regret for a lot of people that were involved in the Civil War, right? That is coming from the point of view from the North, that is. And the thing here is that is the war worth it? Right? By 1863, every family on the block knows somebody that's dead, right? Your father, your cousin, your brother, your uncle, whoever it is. And they've been churned up in this endless thing that's the American Civil War, and it's a parallel to anything that we're even doing now. I want you to think about the Russian-Ukraine war, right? You have some people who are saying, well, this is so fundamental that you can't stop it or you can't even mitigate it because that's just going to empower a dictator, which of course is Vladimir Putin. And then on the other hand, people are saying, how much money should we spend on this? What is the plan for victory? Can you define victory? Right? Is 10 billion enough? Is 20 billion enough? Is a trillion enough? Is 10 years enough? Is 20 years enough? You see? So anytime you have any kind of a thing where you're spending a lot of money and a lot of treasure and a lot of people, right? In this case, it was I mean, it wasn't halfway across the world. It was right in it might be in your neighborhood, literally, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and let alone the South, what was going on down there later on with Sherman, etc. Define victory for me. So Lincoln has to he's got a political thing to do here in this Thanksgiving proclamation. He's got to make it seem and reassure everybody in the North that the war is worth it and that we are winning it, you see? And at the same time, he's got to say that generally speaking, other than the war, things are going pretty well, right? And that's not easy to do under the circumstances. You see, at the same time, in a moral sense, what he does is he takes the Civil War and he basically says that we are being punished by God for our sins, the sin of slavery. And so, in other words, this is kind of like the Civil War for Lincoln was a cleansing that had to happen. It was a kind of penance that the United States was involved with for the sin of going against God, for allowing slavery to exist, right? It's a fascinating document to read, right? I'll see how much time we have after this. I'll come back to it. George McClellan, 1862. George McClellan is the head of the Union Army, right? The head of the Union Army in general, and he's the head of the Union Army fighting directly against Lee on the eastern or the northern part of the war, right? The war can be divided into the western half and the eastern half. The eastern half is the part we know that has Lincoln, not Lincoln rather, but General Lee, right? And the Army of Northern Virginia. versus the Army of the Potomac. And McClellan was in charge. And he was an excellent, I guess today we would use the word bureaucrat, right? Not something that's kind of an insult to a military officer, but came to a point where Lincoln was completely intolerant of McClellan because McClellan was too passive, in a sense. Lee, trained in West Point, of course, Lee was able to pick the time and pick the place and therefore had the strategic advantage and was always forcing McClellan to respond to what Lee was doing. So you can see the advantage, the strategic advantage that the aggressor has in this case, Lee. And even when the Union won, McClellan didn't capitalize on the gain and try to follow up and annihilate Lee's army. McClellan would back off, regroup, right? We have similar arguments today, I guess, well, not today, but in World War II history. And that if you were going to talk about people's complaints about Bernard Montgomery, it would have been something similar, right? Like if you were going to ask a Patton versus a Montgomery. Montgomery wanted to make sure that everything was in order before he moved, even if it meant, for his critics at least, that he had lost the time, he had lost the initiative, you see? And McClellan was on a different time schedule, like a different priority schedule than Lincoln. And I'm breaking this down because this is very important to understand Lincoln's presidency. Lincoln is, from the moment that he was elected, he is on a ticking clock. If he cannot prove to the voting public that we are winning the war, he is going to be voted out of office in 1864. All right, so 1864 is going to be the most important election in the history of the country, right? Like we haven't heard that recently, you see? And the reason why that would be is because by 1864, the voting public doesn't have confidence that Lincoln is going to make good on the assessment that we're winning and are going to win or have won. Then they're going to say, the hell with this. Let the South go do what the hell they want. You see, that was what was at stake in 1864. So Lincoln had to get the job done. He had to have something demonstrable on the table to say, look, here is concrete evidence that the war is being won. If you can't do that, he will lose the election. And then what's going to happen is his opponents, the Democrats, are essentially in favor of slavery. And then all would have been for naught. All of the people we lost by 1864, they would have all died in vain. And he would have lost, and the country and world history would have been completely different. So Lincoln didn't have the time to dally around and let his entire army get jerked around by Lee. Lincoln needed to get somebody who got the job done, who got in there and finished what he set out to do, no matter what, with more initiative. And that's how, of course, Grant wound up in there eventually. Grant was making a name for himself out west, right, which was by the Mississippi, by the way. And that's what caught Lincoln's attention, where he needed somebody like Grant. Now, Grant had his own baggage and his own story. But you see, that's why Grant was actually chosen, because Lincoln had to seal the deal. I don't know if that, how many, I'm assuming that everyone in my audience today is at least as old as I am, right? When I was a kid, the largest backdrop to, I don't know, events, excuse me, um, was the Vietnam War, right? I mean, I literally grew up watching that on the floor, looking up at the TV, right? I mean, early, when I mean, how old was I in 1963, 1964? Like 5 years old, 6 years old. And my father watched the news and I hated it at the time, but I think I learned a lot. And I was sitting there and it was just like this little skinny country with all of these names that I couldn't pronounce. And it was all very, you know, and it was in retrospect when we talk about Vietnam, what was it? It was we had this big pushback in our own country about the fact that, you keep telling us we're winning, but you know what? It kind of like doesn't seem like we're winning anything. And, how much is this going to cost? And what did my brother die for? What did my father die for? Should I go to Canada, instead of being drafted in a war to go and kill babies, right? Do you remember that? Well, it wasn't a different situation here, you know. It was like, why are we doing this? Is it worth it? So Lincoln fires McClellan and he brings in others and then Grant, right? Now, meanwhile, McClellan, who has an ego, right? Now, I'm not saying that it's a I don't want to make it more of a criticism than it needs to be because I don't know. I mean, how do you get to be a general and not have an ego? How do you get to be a CEO of something and not have an ego? How do you get to be president, whoever the president is, and not have an ego? I mean, you got to have a little bit of narcissism to do these things. So I got to be careful with my diagnoses on that standpoint. And the thing is that the ego part of it, I mean, McClellan didn't want to get fired, but he got fired. So who do you think is running that the Democratic Party picked up to be Lincoln's Democratic opponent in the 1864 election? I give you none other than Mr. McClellan. Okay, how's that for payback? How do you like them apples? Oh, you fired me? Well, guess what? I'm going to beat you in the 1864 election now. You see? And that's remarkable. I mean, it's just remarkable. And what is McClellan's platform? McClellan's platform, the Democratic platform, is that there's going to be one out of two things. We're either going to allow the southern states to do what the hell they want and remain in the Union. In other words, legalize, permanently codify slavery, or we're going to allow them to cast off as the Confederate States of America. Now, either two of those events would have completely changed the history of the United States and consequently would have changed the history of the world, you see? And you know what? 1864 was the most important election in United States history up to 1864. If Lincoln wins, that means that the American public is still behind him and will support him to get the job done to finish the war. If Lincoln is defeated, it means that the public has basically said the hell with it. Let the South do what they want. So this is I don't know, we use the O.J. Simpson term. This is the dream team, right? The dream team, right? So now Lincoln finally, by 1864, right? Late 1863 into 1864, right? Now he's got the team in place. And instead of what McClellan was doing was just responding to what Lee was doing, now the North has taken the initiative, the strategy, right? So you've got Lincoln, you've got Porter, that's Sherman and Grant, of course. You see, and now it's a coordinated effort economically, strategically, militarily, and foreign policy, okay, to be able to defeat the South. Remember, a constant threat to the North, right, to the Union, was that one day the South was going to be recognized as a sovereign government, the Confederate States of America, if it was recognized by Great Britain as, yes, we acknowledge that the Confederate States of America is a sovereign entity. That would have changed world history. If the French did that, if anybody did that, it would have changed history. The North had to now, the world had become small enough, even back in those days, where what happened in the United States was being watched by everybody. And everybody wanted to have their political alliances and everything else like that. And the South desperately wanted to get another major European nation to to give its stamp of approval of legitimacy, right? If you don't think these things are important, here's two examples. Exhibit A would be our own country. I mean, what would we have done if France never um, acknowledged the United States of America as a sovereign government while we were fighting Great Britain, right? There's example number one. Example number two is, of course, Israel, right? If the United States had not come out, had Harry Truman specifically, I should add, not come out specifically in support of the sovereign state of Israel, which had declared its independence, what was it, 1948? What would have happened to Israel? You see? So the South wanted that. And it was very, very important for Lincoln to make sure that didn't happen. You see? In all of the other countries, they're watching who's winning, who's losing, what battle. I mean, if it seemed like Lee was going to keep winning, then the other countries might have joined in and said, yeah, these people really have their act together. We want to open negotiations with the new sovereign country, the Confederate States of America. It was Lincoln's responsibility in foreign policy to make sure that did not happen. That's another reason why, from a matter of perception, you had to make sure that the South was losing. And this was the team that was going to get it done. And we talk about Sherman, the entire run to the South, right? From Tennessee to Atlanta to the Carolinas, right? The Great March to the Sea. That was a psychological operation designed to show the people of the Deep South that their own army couldn't even protect them at home. You see? And to show the world that the South is obviously lost. That's how important that was. Now, if you want to see what something like this does to a man, you can take a picture of Lincoln before and after some of this. I mean, this wasn't exactly easy on him. I don't know. I remember, I mean, any president or most presidents, I guess. I remember before President Obama was elected, and then after like 8 or 9 years or whatever it was, from the time he was a senator, I mean, he had a few gray hairs on him, and not to say that he wouldn't have anyway, but I just tend to think that these things age people, you know. So you can see, I mean, it was just a tremendous weight on Lincoln. Here's another example, by the way, of that same phenomenon. Here's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933, on his ascension to federal power. And then here he is in the beginning of 1945. Now, I know that he's not a well man, and I don't know, fortunately in my lifetime, I don't know enough about what polio does to a person. Um, but I mean, that really, it's when you look at these side by side photographs, it's stunning. And then, of course, we come to the famous story of his assassination, right? Now, this is an attraction to this day in Washington, right? The Ford's Theater, and what's the name of that play they went to see? My American Cousin, I think it was. and that is what the presidential um, on the what do you call these things? Booths. Um, and there's a picture of looks like a picture of either Hamilton or Jefferson in the front. I can't see it on the small screen, but there's the actual, there it is. That's where he was watching the play from, Lincoln. And of course, as you know, he gets shot behind the ear, he gets shot in the head, and by one John Wilkes Booth. There's a gun, by the way. I mean, the gun. The gun that John Wilkes Booth used to kill Abraham Lincoln, 1865. I don't know. I don't know if that's a Derringer, if that's a type of gun or the name of a gun. Um, and, obviously that's concealable. And he was just able to get right there behind Lincoln's head and just shot him. He didn't die right away, Lincoln. He died the next morning across the street, which I understand it is sort of another tourist attraction, another sort of macabre tourist attraction about Lincoln's death, where he died the next morning. So, what was John Wilkes Booth? What was his what was his problem, right? What was his beef? And John Wilkes Booth was a Virginian, and when he shot Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth was thinking of the American Revolution, right? John Wilkes Booth, as a Southerner, was thinking of the American Revolution, and that Lincoln represented the failure of American democracy to John Wilkes Booth. You see? In other words, Lincoln had succeeded in what he set out to do, which was to preserve the Union, which meant that the South had lost their right to their sovereignty, which to John Wilkes Booth meant that the federal government now has become corrupted, with Lincoln as its head, for perverting the Constitution and taking away the sovereign rights and freedoms of the states. You see? And Lincoln deserved to die for it. And John Wilkes Booth, as you know, jumps out of here, lands on the stage, right, where he breaks his leg, and it's in a whole nother story, which we could talk about some other day. But what does John Wilkes Booth scream as he's there in the booth, now that everybody's got their attention because of the gunshot? Sic semper tyrannis. Sic semper tyrannis, which is if you look at the Virginia state flag, which I don't think they've changed. The Virginia state flag, it's a like a Revolutionary War depiction, and it's the proud state of Virginia, and it on the flag it has a royal figure with a crown laying next to a figure laying on the ground, right? So you can see it's a royal figure that has been fallen, and a robed figure above it in triumph. And it says Sic semper tyrannis, and it means thus always to tyrants. That's what it means in Latin. So in other words, King George deserved to be overthrown. We, the United States of America, were righteous in overthrowing tyranny, tyranny representing that authority which was abusing its authority of the government. Now, for John Wilkes Booth, he was a representation of the South who felt as though the federal government had abused their authority as the federal government in prosecuting the war against the South. And therefore, if it was righteous in the revolutionary days to overthrow a tyrannical government, that one that's abusing their power over the governed, then how is it not equally righteous to overthrow a government that is now, in our current day, being tyrannical to its own people? right? And that's the way John Wilkes Booth saw it. So that's why he was very righteous in shooting the representative. He was to John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln was King George III. You see, it's important, I think, for context. The Derringer. I assume that's just a one-shot pistol. Lincoln Shays, guys, now he's not dead yet. See, Lincoln shot, condition considered hopeless, right? Will not live through the night, doctors declare, and that, of course, turned out to be true. Lincoln Memorial. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. Of course, Mount Rushmore, which has its own controversies today. And but there's Lincoln. It's just I mean, it's just awesome that people could carve that into the side of a rock edifice, right? But a few quotes. The probability that we may fail in this struggle ought not to deter us from the support of a cause we believe to be just. That's Abraham Lincoln. It's referring, of course, to the war. We should be too big to take offense and too noble to give it. No, how's that for an aspiration, right? We should be too big to take offense and too noble to give it. You know, Lincoln's got a great sense of humor. He's a funny guy. His father was a funny guy. And success is going from failure to failure without losing your enthusiasm, right? That's Lincoln. So one of the things that we use Lincoln for today in like psychology or, you know, if you're talking about motivational training, you'll bring up Lincoln because Lincoln is an example of somebody who fell on his face like 20 times. And obviously he's, you know, considered one of the most noble parts of our history or memory, etc. See, so in other words, the idea is like, don't let failure get you down. Keep going, right? So that is tied to Lincoln. I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends. He was the only president who had a patent. He patented something when he was doing this boating thing, he came up with some kind of a contraption. I don't know what it was to actually get a boat unstuck. You know, they had these flatboats on the Mississippi. And if you ran onto a shoal, obviously you were stuck. And he created something to get you unstuck. All right. He had a patent. I like this one a lot, you know, from my own standpoint. My way of describing this would be called delayed gratification. Okay. Discipline is choosing between what you want now and what you want the most. You see? So are you going to take what you want right at the moment for instant gratification and lose sight of the long game? You see? This is a good one. I like this one. Discipline is choosing between what you want now and what you want the most. When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That's my religion, Abraham Lincoln. You know, by this generation, the kind of rhetoric about God this and God that, God in every sentence, like an Abraham, not an Abraham, but George Washington would have had, it's been tempered somewhat. You know, it's not like people weren't religious. It's not like they didn't believe in God or the Bible. It's just that they didn't speak like somebody from the founding generation. They didn't speak like pilgrims, you know. A lot of the terminology here, you know, I want you to think about it in current terms about our own policy differences in government, about governance. about people being empowered to help themselves versus the federal government being as large as they can be, or large enough to actually be benevolent to the people. It's you can see through Lincoln also the emergence of a real manifestation of what I'll call Jeffersonianism versus Hamiltonianism. And Lincoln is more Jeffersonian in the sense that we should make government as small as it can be, but people should be empowered and be able to have their own agency. And that is what will really make them successful. And if you keep giving people stuff, that's not going to work, right? So you can see that emerge in Lincoln. You cannot help men permanently by doing for them what they could and should do for themselves. Here's a good one. I like this a lot. Give me 6 hours, Lincoln says. Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe, right? So this is, of course, a lesson of common sense and preparation. Preparation. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves. Of course, we're talking about the moral issues of slavery. I walk slowly, but I never walk backwards, right? So the guy is deliberative. But he takes the time, it's like the previous slide. He takes the time to make a decision, and then it's done. He doesn't equivocate after that. This one's a repeat. I have always found that mercy bears richer fruits than strict justice, right? Excuse me. Now, this is to become very, very important. It doesn't seem like much on the face of it. This is a big deal. At Appomattox, when Grant was presenting terms to Lee, who had surrendered the army of Northern Virginia, which basically was the end of the Confederacy, right? Grant was presenting what had been agreed upon. That was Lincoln's policy. And Lincoln's policy was that we have won. Do we want to win in the way that the Europeans win against an adversary, which is to we're the victors and you're the vanquished, and we're going to take everything you've got and we're going to exploit you, okay? And then literally right at that moment create another war because you hate us so badly now that your children are going to grow up to want to vanquish us, you see? And that's very prophetic, in a sense. Lincoln didn't want that to happen. Lincoln recognized the unique situation we were in at the end of the Civil War, where it's not like we beat Imperial Japan at the end of World War II. What we won in the Civil War was a war against other Americans. That's different. It's kind of like you got to have to make up somehow. And now we have to find a way to live with each other again, you see? And by the time 630,000 military people had been killed, uh, the North and the South pretty much hated each other, you see? How do you put that back together? And that was a task that is enormously significant. We have to accept the fact that the Southern states, if they just agree to just abide by the Constitution again, deal with the fact that we're not going to have any more slaveholding states, and slavery is going to be made illegal in the United States via the 13th Amendment, right, and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which were follow-ups to the 13th. We have to incorporate them back to being full Americans. We have to, or we can't go on as a country. You see, all of the statues and things that you saw, that were in after the George Floyd riots that were being taken down and all the rest of that stuff, including Lee down in Richmond and, various other places where anything Confederate has been canceled. Those statues, including at Arlington National Cemetery, anything commemorating the Confederacy now is like pretty much, verboten. But it was important to make the South feel as though, as Americans, they were noble in their purpose. Right now, of course, that's completely intolerable by 2024 standards, right? But it was during the period of time between, like, I don't know, 1880 and the beginning of World War One. You had the erection of many, you had the reincorporation, at least of the nobility or the bravery, if you will, of the Southern forces, because you couldn't go on together as a country with a united military, etc., if the South was going to still be the vanquished and the North was going to be the intolerant victors, you see. So that's why Lincoln wanted to make sure that he was as benevolent as possible to Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. It's like, you can keep your firearm. If that horse belongs to you, take it with you, go home. That's it. Now, Reconstruction is a little more complicated than that, but the essence of it here is this. The greatest mistake after this, right, would be an example of what happened at the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War One at the hand of the damn French and the English, the French particularly, where they were so punitive on the Germans that they literally, before the ink was dry on the Treaty of Versailles, you're already working towards World War II. You see? It's a very important thing right here. I would rather be a little nobody than to be an evil somebody. House divided against itself cannot stand, of course. Truth is generally the best vindication against slander. Well, they didn't have social media, or as Winston Churchill said, you know, a lie will get what halfway around the world before the truth has its chance to get its pants on. Was that it? Cannot strengthen the weak, Lincoln says. You cannot strengthen the weak by weakening the strong. He's talking about social policy. In other words, a false equality in this viewpoint. You see, okay, well, we want everybody to have an equal outcome, which is called equity today. So that means that essentially we have to take this from you. We're keeping you from being so high, and then kind of almost artificially bringing these people up. And then we can say that we've achieved equity, you see. Um, that's the way I interpret this particular quote. Portrait of Achiever. This, of course, is all of the things that he flunked at, and he still became the president. When you reach the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. Right? That's a joke. I've been driven many times upon my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for the day. Now, here's a joke. A foreign diplomat walked into Lincoln's office while the president was polishing his own shoes. Mr. President, you black your own boots? Lincoln, yes. Whose boots do you black? He's a jokester. And then this is one of my favorites. Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak out and remove all doubt. That's pretty cool, actually. The best way to predict your future is to create it. Leave nothing for tomorrow, which can be done to today, which can be done today, which was modified by my generation to leave nothing for tomorrow, which can be done 2 days from now, right? Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. And I love about history, any history, this history, is that, I run into a lot of people, hundreds of people every week, right, in my travels. A little less now, but nevertheless. People think that all the stuff we're going through and human nature and circumstances and people's reactions to circumstances, it's like, oh, it's a modern thing. It's not a modern thing. It's not modern at all. There's precedent. I believe the Bible is the best gift God has ever given to man. All the good of the Savior of the world is communicated to us through the book. I like to see a man proud of the country in which he lives. I like to see a man live so that his country will be proud of him. Be sure to put your feet in the right place, then stand firm. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. I wish, if we had another hour, I wouldn't have any trouble filling it. My concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is to be on God's side, for God is always right. We, the people, are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. If we've learned anything in today's lecture, or even in our own times, it's a perception of who is perverting the Constitution, right? I assure you that when Southerners prayed to God at night, they felt as though God was on their side. That is why I like to do things and put as much context as possible into this so we understand what people's points of views are. You know, I had some other slides and things to talk about, but that's all right. We're out of time, believe it or not, an hour and a half. Here's something that somebody gave me. And she was cleaning out her house. This belonged to her father, who she loved dearly and who's passed. And her father was a Civil War buff and was enamored of Southern generals, right? All of which who went to West Point, etc. You see, and there's no market for these things, and she can't get rid of any of the stuff that her father has because of its focus on Confederacy. So she gives it to me, knowing that I'm a historian. And now I have this. This is General Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, and Lee. And the reason why it's right now it's not in vogue because Confederate anything has been canceled, right? Understanding it, its similarities, its overlaps with ourselves, you know. If we can't create a place where we understand things like this, then we're not going to understand ourselves. It's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in my opinion. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you. I guess it's next week. And that is going to be a fascinating story about one Ulysses S. Grant. And I want to thank you for spending a time with me and for signing up for this program. Right. God bless you all. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks,
You're
Art.
welcome.
Good as usual. Have a good holiday.
I appreciate it.
Curious question, sir. Are you familiar with Aaron Copland's Lincoln portrait?
Aaron Copland's what?
It's a piece called Lincoln Portrait that quotes many of Lincoln's quotes and some of the Gettysburg Address.
No,
Oh,
no, no. I've probably seen some of the content there in other publications that I have.
yeah.
Hmm. I love the Gettysburg Address.
Oh, yeah. I
It's good stuff.
I got a commemorative. It's a giant penny, but I visited the site of the Battle of Shiloh earlier this year.
Yeah.
Got that giant penny, and it has the whole Gettysburg Address inscribed on the back.
Right. Well, I wish I would have had the time. I wanted to talk more about the Emancipation Proclamation, etc. We'll have to hit it another time. It's just amazing how fast the time goes when we're doing this. So anyway, I gotta log off. See you soon, all right?
Take care.